Hi, it's Patrick, and in today's episode, we look inside enclosures where wild animals turned innocent visits into gruesome zoo fatalities. From a groundskeeper finding a dismembered arm inside the most dangerous exhibit to an aquarium diver trapped inside a shark tank where the water itself became the deadliest threat. It was the afternoon of August 18, 2018, inside a privately owned wildlife park near Cairns, Australia. The reptile section had become one of the park's most popular attractions because of a massive 15-foot saltwater crocodile that regularly drew large crowds during feeding demonstrations. Madison Keller was 23 and had recently finished university before deciding to travel to Australia alone after she had argued with her parents for years because she wanted to fulfill her dream of becoming a wildlife content creator. Since she was in high school, she had become obsessed with wild animals, and she had spent most of her free time posting wildlife videos she loved online. Her parents refused to support that because they saw it as a reckless fantasy. They told her she was chasing internet attention instead of building a real future. So she took the Australian trip just to prove them wrong. She had made up her mind to capture extreme footage that could finally make her go viral. Before leaving, she told family members she wanted footage nobody else would dare to record. During the trip, she visited dangerous wildlife attractions repeatedly, looking for chances to film close encounters with predators. I see the dream and the ambition, and that's totally fine. Making your own way and erasing the doubts of the people who questioned you. On August 18, 2018, crowds gathered around the crocodile enclosure before the scheduled feeding demonstration. Large warning signs instructed visitors to stay behind the safety barriers and away from the water, but Madison ignored them. After the demonstration ended and the crowds dispersed, Madison drifted toward a quieter, restricted section beside the reptile exhibit near a staff maintenance corridor. Warning signs marked the area as employees only, separated from the enclosure by a perimeter security fence and locked service gate. Investigators later determined Madison had climbed over part of the restricted barrier to get closer to the water for filming. Focused on getting the crocodile in the shot behind her, Madison stepped onto the wet rocks near the enclosure edge and leaned backward to widen the camera angle. Her foot suddenly slipped across the slick surface and she crashed down the sloped embankment toward the water. Her phone flew from her hand as she tried unsuccessfully to pull herself back onto the rock before part of her body entered the enclosure. Investigators later believed the crocodile struck almost immediately after Madison entered the water. Drag marks across the wet rocks, disturbed vegetation near the shoreline, and the position of her recovered phone and camera equipment suggested she had attempted to pull herself back toward the walkway before being dragged deeper into the enclosure. At 15 feet long and weighing an estimated 1,100 pounds, the crocodile would have been capable of causing catastrophic traumatic injuries within seconds through rotational force alone. Recovery evidence and disturbance patterns in the water were later found to be consistent with repeated rolling behavior before Madison disappeared beneath the surface entirely. It was a groundskeeper during a late afternoon perimeter check who found her phone first, then spotted the camera rig near the waterline beside what initially appeared to be animal remains, partially submerged near the rock. After moving closer, he realized it was a human arm and immediately radioed for help. Wildlife staff and emergency responders arrived within minutes, but recovery efforts were delayed until the crocodile could be safely redirected away from the enclosure edge. By the time crews recovered Madison from the water, large portions of her body had already been severely consumed and mutilated by the crocodile. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Officials confirmed that staff had warned Madison multiple times to stay behind the safety barriers before the incident. Investigators found no fault with the enclosure design or barrier placement, and the inquest later recorded the death as accidental. No criminal charges were filed. The crocodile was not euthanized. Following the incident, the zoo installed additional fencing along the maintenance side walkway and restricted public access to several perimeter sections of the reptile exhibit during and after feeding demonstrations. She went there to be seen, and I think about that every time I look at this case. Her parents deleted everything afterward. Now, Madison's story was about a choice she made. The next one I found is different because the man at the center of it had done everything right. He had flagged the danger. He had asked for the repairs. Nobody listened. It was September 12, 2019, at a struggling regional zoo outside Houston, Texas. The zoo is known for its large elephant habitat. The zoo had been losing visitors and money for years. The facility stayed open largely because of financial backing from a wealthy wildlife sponsor who refused to let it shut down completely. Carlos Mendez was 56 years old, and he had spent more than 20 years working at the zoo as a senior elephant handler. After he lost his wife years earlier, the job had become the only stable income he uses to support his 2 children. Co-workers described Carlos as being calm, experienced, and one of the few handlers that can be trusted around stressed elephants. He had flagged problems with the enclosure's electrical fence system that's been aging more than once. Parts of the barrier had malfunctioned during severe weather on a regular basis. But because of the zoo's financial problems, repairs were continually delayed. And I want you to sit with that for a second. He reported it, he put it in writing, and then he kept showing up every day because his kids needed him to. Since the late afternoon, dark storm clouds had covered the area. By sunset, heavy rain and violent wind were already pounding the property. Water had flooded sections of the zoo, while thunder rolled across the old enclosures. During the storm, a nearby lightning strike hit a part of the electric fence surrounding the elephant habitat to short out. Sparks snapped through rain-soaked wiring, and loud electrical bursts cracked through the enclosure. The sudden noise made the herd panic instantly. African elephants have highly sensitive hearing, and sudden electrical cracking or thunder can quickly trigger panic in captive herds. Several elephants began trumpeting and backing into each other. One large male became increasingly distressed, slamming against a support post and throwing mud across the habitat. The fence had partially failed, but had not collapsed. Staff feared the animal might force his way through the weakened section if the panic continued. Carlos rushed toward the service trench near the damaged fence with another keeper, trying to redirect the elephant away from the barrier before it gave way. As he moved through the muddy ground beside the drainage trench, he slipped. The fall startled the elephant further. Already overwhelmed by the storm and the noise around him, the animal charged directly toward Carlos before he could get back to his feet. A startled elephant reacts instinctively. Carlos tried to regain his footing. He did not make it. The elephant struck him and slammed him against the trench embankment, then trampled him repeatedly in the mud, while terrified staff scrambled to activate emergency containment procedures. Paramedics staged outside the enclosure while zoo staff worked to isolate the animal and secure the habitat. By the time emergency responders safely reached Carlos, he had suffered catastrophic chest trauma, multiple crushed organs, severe internal bleeding, and extensive compressive injuries consistent with repeated strikes from an animal of that size. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The death was ruled accidental. No criminal charges were filed against zoo management. The zoo suspended elephant handling operations pending a full safety review. Carlos left behind 2 children. He had worked at the zoo longer than either of them had been alive. Investigators later confirmed the elephant never fully escaped the enclosure. The animal's panic was determined to have been triggered by the electrical failure and storm conditions. Maintenance records showed the fence system had been flagged for urgent repair 14 months before the incident, but no work had been completed. The zoo remained closed for several weeks following the incident, while state investigators reviewed safety procedures and enclosure maintenance records. Multiple violations related to deferred repairs and emergency preparedness were later documented during the investigation. The next story is different though, because this time it wasn't neglect that caused it. One guy decided the rules didn't apply to him, and it didn't just affect him. It was the afternoon of the 22nd of July, 2017, at a privately operated wildlife park outside Denver, Colorado. The zoo had recently gained attention online because of close-up social media videos filmed near its brown bear habitat. Employees at the park regularly dealt with visitors attempting to feed the animals despite warning signs posted throughout the enclosure area. 29-year-old Charles Liang had traveled to the zoo with friends during a cross-country road trip. He was born in California to Chinese-American parents and had spent months watching online wildlife videos that showed tourists feeding captive bears at roadside attractions and smaller overseas animal parks. Over time, he felt zoo safety warnings are exaggerated rules meant mainly to protect visitors from liability issues rather than the actual danger. To be honest, I get why people think that, because a lot of rules do feel like overreach, but what happens next changes everything. The brown bear enclosure enclosure housed 3 adult bears, including a large male known by staff for becoming highly territorial around food. Keepers had previously warned visitors several times that summer about throwing snacks into the habitat because it could trigger aggressive competition between the animals. That afternoon, Charles stood near the front viewing barrier holding a paper bag containing trail mix and beef jerky. Despite nearby warnings from both staff and other visitors, he tossed pieces of food into the enclosure while laughing with friends nearby. The bears immediately moved toward the same section of the habitat. Meanwhile, several visitors stayed near the railing, watching the animals compete for the food while recording videos on their phones. Moments later, Charles accidentally dropped the entire bag into the enclosure. All 3 bears rushed toward it at once. The larger male bear began aggressively pushing against the others near the front section of the habitat. During the struggle, the larger bear slammed against a service access gate connected to a maintenance corridor beside the enclosure. Staff had previously reported intermittent locking problems with the gate earlier that summer, but repairs had been delayed. The impact caused the weakened latch mechanism to partially give way. Before employees could react, the bear pushed partway into the narrow service corridor bordering the public viewing area, triggering panic as nearby visitors began screaming and running toward the exits. Charles had been standing closest to the damaged opening when the animal forced into the corridor. As he turned to escape with the crowd, he stumbled near the edge of the viewing platform and fell hard onto the concrete below. The bear reached him within seconds during the confusion, knocking him to the ground and mauling him before staff could pull the animal away. Keepers used emergency noise deterrents and vehicles to force the animal back toward the enclosure, while additional staff evacuated nearby visitors from the predator section. Emergency medical crews and fire rescue personnel arrived within minutes. Charles was transported to a medical center in critical condition, but was pronounced dead shortly afterward from traumatic injuries sustained during the incident. Authorities later concluded that the attack was triggered by a combination of unsafe feeding behavior, food-related territorial aggression between the bears, and the failure of the damaged secondary barrier gate. Several videos recorded by visitors during the incident were later reviewed as part of the investigation. But here's where it gets harder for me, because the next person I'm about to tell you about, he never touched anything, never crossed any barrier, never broke a single rule. It was the afternoon of August 18, 2015, at a wildlife education center outside Phoenix, Arizona. The facility regularly hosted reptile demonstrations for tourists and school groups inside a small indoor amphitheater connected to the reptile house. Frank Ellison was 31 years old and had traveled from Atlanta, Georgia during a vacation through the American Southwest after years working overnight shifts at a shipping warehouse. Friends described him as quiet, patient, and deeply interested in reptiles and desert wildlife. Earlier that afternoon, veterinary staff had completed routine examinations on several reptiles inside the facility, including a western diamondback rattlesnake used for controlled educational displays outside public contact areas. Facility policy prohibited venomous reptiles from entering occupied presentation spaces while visitors were present. Following the examinations, staff temporarily placed several transport containers on a wheeled containment cart near the rear exit of the amphitheater while reorganizing equipment. The rattlesnake's transport container had not been fully secured inside the required secondary locked containment box after the transfer. During the presentation, Frank stepped away from his seat to record part of the demonstration from a different angle near the back aisle. While moving backward through the narrow walkway, he bumped into the containment cart positioned behind him. One of the transport containers fell from the cart and struck the concrete floor. Witnesses appeared briefly confused by the noise before staff began moving toward the rear of the amphitheater. One of the locking clips on the container had not been completely fastened. When the case hit the floor, the lid shifted partially open. Marcus reached toward the fallen container before realizing what was inside. The rattlesnake delivered a defensive bite to his right hand as he pulled away. That instinct to reach down and pick something up, I think most of us would have done exactly the same thing. That's what makes this one so hard for me to process. Western diamondback rattlesnakes are among the most medically significant venomous snakes in North America. Their venom is hemotoxic, destroying red blood cells and tissue while disrupting the blood's ability to clot. A significant envenomation can trigger hemorrhage, organ failure, and cardiovascular collapse within hours, even with treatment. Staff secured the snake immediately using hooks and containment tubs, while employees evacuated visitors and contacted emergency dispatchers and poison control. Paramedics arrived within minutes and found Marcus in rapidly worsening condition with severe pain, swelling spreading up his right arm, vomiting, and falling blood pressure consistent with significant envenomation. He was transported to a university medical center where physicians administered crofab antivenom and admitted him to intensive care. Despite aggressive treatment, his condition continued deteriorating overnight. He developed coagulopathy, acute kidney injury, and respiratory failure requiring mechanical ventilation. His blood pressure could not be stabilized despite additional antivenom doses, blood products, and vasopressor support. Frank Ellison suffered cardiac arrest during the early morning hours of August 19th and could not be resuscitated. The medical examiner recorded his cause of death as multi-organ failure and cardiovascular collapse resulting from severe rattlesnake envenomation. A state investigation concluded the incident resulted from improper secondary containment procedures following the veterinary examination. The rattlesnake's transport container had not been resecured before being placed near an occupied public area in violation of facility safety protocols. The education center received citations for the containment failure and suspended all venomous reptile handling pending a full procedural review. What I'm about to tell you next happened underwater after closing hours, and the man inside the tank had no idea anything was wrong until it was already too late. It was the night of November 11, 2017, at a large public aquarium in Baltimore, Maryland. Maintenance work inside the facility's largest exhibits was performed after closing hours once visitors had left the building. Blake Turner was 34 years old and had worked at the aquarium for nearly 8 years as a commercial dive technician, responsible for cleaning deep water exhibit and inspecting submerged equipment. Before joining the aquarium, he had spent several years performing offshore industrial diving work in the Gulf of Mexico and was regarded as one of the facility's most experienced divers. That evening, Blake was assigned to inspect and clean sections of the aquarium's primary shark exhibit, a massive tank housing several sand tiger shark and reef shark. Standard procedure required all large animals to be isolated from divers during underwater work and required strict lockout controls preventing circulation pumps and automated feeding systems from activating while personnel were inside the tank. Neither condition was fully met that night. I have to be sincere. When I first read that line in the investigation report, I had to go back and read it again. Neither condition was fully met, and they still sent him in. A mechanical failure earlier that day had affected one of the secondary holding pools used to temporarily relocate animals during maintenance. Repairs were still ongoing, so several sharks remained inside the primary exhibit longer than scheduled. Some circulation equipment had also been placed under temporary manual override while engineering crews accessed parts of the filtration system. The aquarium had recently hired a new overnight systems assistant named Darren Cole, who had not yet completed training on active dive operations or temporary override procedures. Shortly after Blake entered the exhibit through a rear maintenance hatch, Darren began preparing the life support system for the tank's scheduled overnight feeding cycle from the control room. Earlier maintenance logs appeared to show the dive work had already concluded. Blake's entry status had not been updated after a departmental shift change. Believing the exhibit was clear, Darren reactivated several high-capacity circulation pumps connected to the feeding system. Inside the tank, the water movement increased rapidly near the rear filtration structures. Sediment lifted off the bottom and suspended throughout the water column, dropping visibility to near zero within seconds. Blake attempted to stabilize himself in the worsening current. Investigators later determined he likely collided head-first with a submerged steel support beam during that movement. The impact dislodged his regulator and left him severely disoriented. The combination of strong current, near zero visibility, and likely concussion prevented him from recovering his backup air supply. Employees monitoring the system believed Blake had already exited. Overlapping repairs and incomplete documentation had delayed recognizing that a diver was still inside. Several minutes passed before another employee noticed Blake's tether line and equipment cart still positioned beside the maintenance corridor and alerted the control room. Staff initiated emergency shutdown procedures and diverted the sharks toward the opposite side of the exhibit using supplemental feeding. Emergency dive personnel entered through a secondary service hatch and located Blake unconscious beside the filtration structures near the bottom of the tank. He was removed from the water without signs of responsiveness and transported to Johns Hopkins Hospital. Blake Turner was pronounced dead during the early morning hours of November 12th. The medical examiner concluded he died from drowning caused by hypoxic brain injury, with blunt force head trauma as a major contributing factor. Federal investigators concluded that incomplete employee training, failed lockout procedures, communication failures, and unsafe concurrent maintenance operations all contributed to his death. The next case, though, this one made me genuinely angry when I researched it, because someone at that zoo was selling access to lion enclosures for cash, and people were paying for it. It was the afternoon of the 22nd of September 2019 at a privately owned roadside zoo outside Amarillo, Texas. The small facility sat beside a long desert highway and had quietly developed a reputation for allowing wealthy visitors unusually close access to exotic animals in exchange for private cash payments made directly to employees. 26-year-old Sofia Alvarez worked as a receptionist at a law firm in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Although her salary was modest, her social media accounts presented a completely different image. Nearly every photo she uploaded was carefully staged to make her life appear luxurious and expensive. She rented designer handbags for weekends, posed beside cars she did not own, and spent much of her income creating the appearance of wealth online. Sofia was not trying to become famous. She simply wanted people around her to believe she lived a glamorous lifestyle. And I think that distinction actually matters here. This wasn't about chasing followers. It was about controlling how the people already in her life saw her. That's a different kind of pressure entirely. After seeing photos online of women posing near exotic animals, Sofia became determined to create similar pictures herself. Through social media, she contacted Carlos Navarro, a 22-year-old zoo employee known for privately arranging unauthorized animal encounter for extra money. Carlos agreed to let Sofia enter the lion enclosure after public closing hours for just $2,000 in cash. He assured her that the lions would remain locked behind an interior holding gate while she briefly posed inside the outer habitat. That evening, after visitors had left the property, Carlos guided Sofia through a service corridor behind the carnivore exhibit. She changed into a beige safari-style outfit and entered the enclosure carrying multiple clothing options for photographs. For nearly 15 minutes, Carlos photographed her beside artificial rock and dry grass, while Sofia repeatedly checked the images on her phone. Several photos had to be retaken because portions of the fencing remained visible in the background. Sofia wanted the pictures to look convincing enough that people online would believe she had visited a private wildlife reserve. At approximately 6:40 p.m., another employee named Victor Mendoza began the zoo's normal evening feeding routine on the opposite side of the carnivore building. Victor had not been informed anyone was inside the enclosure. Carlos had also failed to mark the habitat as occupied on the facility's outdated lockboard system. As Victor opened the secondary transfer gate connected to the holding area, one of the adult male lions immediately pushed through into the outer enclosure. The situation changed instantly. Carlos shouted for Sofia not to move, but panic overtook her as the lion crossed the habitat. She stumbled backward while attempting to climb onto the artificial rocks used during the photo shoot. Carlos tried distracting the animal by yelling and striking the fencing with a metal pole, but the lion remained focused on Sofia. Emergency alarms began sounding across the property as employees rushed toward the enclosure. Victor attempted to close the transfer gate again, but the animal had already fully entered the habitat. Staff eventually forced the lion back into the holding section using emergency deterrent equipment, but the attack had already caused catastrophic injuries. Sofia Alvarez was pronounced dead before emergency responders could transport her from the zoo. The investigation that followed exposed severe safety failures throughout the facility, including broken locks, missing incident records, understaffing, and repeated unauthorized animal encounters arranged privately for visitors willing to pay extra money. Carlos Navarro was immediately terminated following the investigation, and multiple employees were later questioned about similar unauthorized animal encounters that had allegedly been arranged privately for years. State investigators also cited the facility for major safety and record-keeping violations tied to after-hours animal access. Every story in this video has involved either a personal decision or an institutional failure. The last one I'm covering today is the one I keep coming back to, because the man who died wasn't there for a photo or a thrill. He jumped off a moving train to save a 7-year-old kid. It was the afternoon of April 14, 2016, at a struggling regional zoo outside Houston, Texas. The park had spent years losing money while maintenance problems piled up across the property. Diego Navarro was 38 years old and had worked as the zoo's train operator for nearly 10 years. He was calm under pressure and known for reacting quickly around children. Management considered him one of the most dependable employees on the property. The zoo itself had been quietly deteriorating for years. Employees had privately complained about damaged walkways, weakened barriers, and maintenance areas that were no longer properly secured. Internal inspection records had showed several areas had been flagged for repairs months earlier. Budget shortages and staffing cuts had pushed the work back repeatedly, with no scheduled completion date. That afternoon, Diego was operating the safari train, carrying families through the north side of the zoo toward the grizzly bear habitat, one of the oldest sections in the park. As the train slowed near the viewing area, he spotted 7-year-old Emilio Reyes slipping underneath a chain restriction barrier near the enclosure edge, while his parents stood distracted in the crowd behind him. Diego activated the emergency brake and jumped from the operator platform before the train had fully stopped. He moved along the narrow maintenance path beside the tracks toward the barrier. Rain earlier that morning had left the concrete wet and covered with leaves blown from nearby trees. The path had not been cleared. I want to be clear about something here. Diego didn't hesitate. He saw that kid and he moved. That tells you everything about who he was. As Diego rounded the corner near the bear enclosure fence, his foot landed on a deteriorated maintenance cover hidden beneath the wet debris. The cover was positioned directly above a concrete service moat, separating the enclosure wall from the keeper maintenance route below. Years of water damage and corrosion had eaten through the structural integrity of the cover from underneath, without any visible surface indication of how compromised it had become. The surface gave way instantly. Diego dropped several feet into the narrow concrete channel below. He struck the edge of the moat head first before landing in the shallow water at the bottom of the flooded service trench. The channel was approximately 3 feet wide and ran along the base of the enclosure wall with no padding or protective surface of any kind. Passengers on the train began screaming. Zoo staff rushed toward the area from nearby sections of the park. Another visitor pulled Emilio back across the barrier moments before he reached the restricted side of the enclosure. Fire rescue crews entered the maintenance trench through an emergency access gate behind the habitat. Diego was found unconscious in the shallow water with severe head trauma and multiple fractures. Paramedics transported him to Memorial Hospital in critical condition. He was pronounced dead less than an hour after arriving at the hospital. The medical examiner recorded his cause of death as fatal traumatic brain injury and hemorrhagic shock resulting from blunt force head impact against the concrete moat edge during the fall. Investigators later confirmed the maintenance cover had been structurally compromised by prolonged water damage and corrosion, and was no longer capable of supporting a person's weight. Internal records showed the area had been flagged for repair months before the incident, but no work had been completed. The zoo later faced multiple safety citations tied to deferred maintenance and restricted area access failures.